Well, I want to welcome all our guests once again to Straight Talk Live. As usual, we want to ask you to share this throughout this presentation and at the end of it. We have a very exciting show coming up. We have uh, Dr. Kevin Cosby. I'm going to call him Kevin because he allows me to. So, but you all know him. I don't have to get into a big introduction except to say he is pastor of St. Stephen Baptist Church, which we all know, as well as president of Simmons College of Kentucky. I would dare say not only the president, but the modern day inspiration for that institution, for which he's due tremendous credit. Very important development in our community. Also, I want to say that, and I say this at the beginning of every show, particularly in this particular season, that we have to be mindful of what's going on in terms of our community. But one of the things that we must be very careful about is to exercise our right to vote. So I want to say that at the beginning, I want to say it at the end. But that being said, let me get to why we're here this morning, the way we are. I want to introduce my guest, Kevin Cosby. And hello, how you doing this morning?
It's a joy to be with you this Saturday morning. I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Well, I'm gonna tell you, I'm very excited about having you here. There are a lot of things that are going on. A lot of the subject matter that I deal with, a lot of the subject matter you deal with, we run across each other. We discuss this quite frequently. Right. But now we have a chance to discuss it to the viewing audience, and I thought this would be a great time. I know that one of the things, I'm gonna jump right into it. I tell the viewing audience what you're working on now that excites you. What's right on the edge there?
Well, I think that, you're a policy man. And I think that successful people are constantly trying to address three policy issues in their lives. And they begin with the letter P. One is public policy. And we'll be talking about that today. But there's also another policy that everyone has that is important. I think public policy is foundational, by the way, because I think the public policy affects the two other policies. And the two other policies are personal policy, public policy, personal policy, in terms of what are you doing with your life? That's your personal policy. And you can always determine what a personal policy is because it's observable. Personal policies are always observable. Example, part of my personal policy is exercising. So I've got me a personal trainer, and 3 days a week, I'm trying to cheat my genetics, and everyone should try to cheat genetics. And I'm working out and lifting weight with my personal trainer. And also, I went back to school. I have a doctorate of ministry degree, which is a professional degree for clergymen, but I wanted an academic degree. So January the 1st, I began working on a PhD.
Wow.
I'm a full-time student, a full-time president, a full-time husband, and a full-time pastor.
Wow.
And so that's my personal policy. But I said there's three P's: public, personal, and then private policy, the way I think. And so I'm trying to think a little bit differently, think a little bit more positively, constantly trying to resolve some issues, some unhealthy thinking patterns that I think all of us have. And so that's what I've been doing.
Wow. Let me get it. Public, personal,
policy,
and private.
It's called private. I call it private policy because private policy is how you think, and no one knows how you think or what you're thinking about. It's private. It's in your mind, but it's important. It impacts how you live. Personal policy is observable. How you eat. I can look at you and tell what your personal policy has been just by the way you talk, your grammar, your health. Are you fitting in the same clothes? That's observable. And then of course, public policy has to do with the policies that government make. And all three are intertwined. It's almost like, when you're flying, when you're on an airplane, when an airplane lands, three things must happen if it's going to land. Number one, the wings must be straight. Two, the nose must be up. Number three, the wheels must be down.
Yeah.
And if you're going to land into success, you've got to have a good private policy. The way you think, you got to eliminate the stinking thinking. The Bible says, as a person thinks, so is he. Then your personal policy, your behavior, and then public policy, which is foundational to everything. What you're doing, in my opinion, in the Senate and the work you do is foundational to the other two policies.
Well, I'll say this because you do some powerful teaching here. But I'll say this, that fundamental to all of that is the third one that you mentioned, and that is the private policy.
Yeah.
But what really strikes me in what you said, though, is that what you're really saying is that, you can get a mindset, you can head off in the direction, you can think you know it all or you know enough.
Yeah.
But it is healthy and important to revisit that and examine that in a very real way.
Yes.
I like that. That's good. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take that one with me. That's my piece for the day. But so, well, we're in a current situation. Some people, some of our friends may tend to say, "Well, wow, where did this come from? This is new." And some of them redefine what it is, etc. But you and I know, and many of our listeners know, that the current day protests didn't come out of thin air.
No, it did not. No,
What's your take on it?
The present day protest, first of all, I applaud it.
Yeah.
I applaud it because I agree with Frederick Douglass that power, and this has been my experience, and this is the truth of Black history, that power concedes nothing except by a demand. And then he said this, it never has.
And it never will.
Never will.
Yeah.
You cannot name me any transformative change that has taken place in the history of Black America that was not precipitated by agitation. In fact, change takes place through agitation, demonstration, negotiations, legislation. We never get to negotiations and legislation through simply forming PACs. And the reason why we can never get to legislation or negotiations and legislation just with PACs, as important as PACs are, is because the majority culture is always able to develop a bigger PAC.
Yeah.
With more wealth in their bigger PAC. It is only when we engage in agitation and demonstration that we can get to the table of negotiation. So I applaud what is taking place. And I think that it is something that is not a moment in time, but I believe it is a movement.
And that's the question. That's
the
fundamental question. You think it's a movement?
I think it is here to stay. And I'm gonna tell you why it's here to stay.
I want to hear that one.
I think the difference between the 60s and the 2020, the long hot summer of 2020.
Oh yeah.
Is something that Gil Scott-Heron said when he said the revolution would not be televised. And I think what Gil Scott-Heron, and this is my interpretation of what Gil Scott-Heron was saying, is that the reason the revolution will not be televised is because television is controlled by white corporate interest. And they're going to frame reality in a way that protects those interests. And television is the primary medium for 50 years through which people learn reality. So for example, if you think about the evolution of television, just to me, the 60s didn't end. The 60s is the longest decade in American history, because it really didn't end until 1970. It ended in 68. It's the shortest decade, because the 60s kind of ended in 68 with the death of King. And the 70s started right then. And there were 3 television programs that were sent to the Black community, I think, that the media was attempting to frame that we had moved, or we were moving to a post-racial America. And those 3 television programs were, think about it. The first one was Good Times. And Good Times was a television program that I think actually depicts Black reality. A family who's living in Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago, with all of the challenges of urban life, just a survival type of situation. We got to survive. So that's Good Times. But then they moved from Good Times to the Jeffersons. And here are the Jeffersons, with George Jefferson moving on up to the East Side, which was a message that Black people now, doors are opening up, and Black people now have the same opportunities to advance beyond poverty, beyond racial caste, just like whites. Blacks now can truly be upwardly mobile like the Jeffersons, and the Jeffersons are up on the East Side and they're fraternizing with their white neighbors. But then there's another television program that came out in the 80s. Now, here you go, from late 60s, 70s, 80s, which took us beyond the Jeffersons, and that is the Huxtables. And the Huxtables were not simply equal to whites as the Jeffersons were, but they had moved beyond whites economically, because you've got one person, I think it's Cosby, who is a doctor, and you've got his wife who's a lawyer, and they're living in a brownstone home, and they're doing quite well. Well, the media controlled the image and gave the impression that we were post-racial. In fact, even President Obama, which he later repented for, tapped into that need in 2004 when he gave his speech at the Democratic convention. And he said, we're not Black America. There's no Black America. There's no right America. There's no rich America. There's no poor America. Well, that's not true. There is a Black America, and there is a white America, and there's a rich America, and there's a poor America. But we were under the illusion of this post-racial America because it was controlled by the primary medium that white people control. 90% of all of the networks are controlled, and news is controlled by white Americans. They control it. They frame it. And to frame it, of course, means you determine what's on the foreground, you determine what's on the background, you determine what gets eliminated. And that's framing. So media says, this is the foreground, this is the background, this is what gets eliminated. What is different about today in 2020 is that this whole movement, like the Arab Spring of 2011, you had the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
That Arab Spring was caused not by mainstream media. It was caused by the same thing that you and I are doing right now. And that is an alternative medium through which people are getting their information. And just as the Arab Spring of 2011, they were radicalized through not state-sponsored media, but through what you are doing with Straight Talk, and that's the internet. And this generation is not being informed by MSNBC, my friend Al Sharpton, Joy Reid, CNN. They're not being informed by them. They're being informed by a new emerging Black media that is taking place through podcast and YouTube and instant messages and tweets. And what was it that drove the George Floyd protest? it was cameras, it was downloaded in media. So what this medium has done, whereas Walter Cronkite would end CBS News every broadcast by saying, now, and that's the way it is. No, it's not. That's the way it is through your lens.
Yeah.
Now, Black people, this has democratized information. So what's going to continue to drive this is the new medium that I think the present day rebellion has tapped into. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna tell you something. I think you're exactly right. I will say this, that when President Obama made those comments and others make those types of comments, they are tactical and strategic. So they understand exactly what you're saying. But what they probably didn't quite grab totally at that time, of course, I got to back up a little bit, because President Obama's campaign, they sort of tapped into that internet tactical thing as a tool.
Mm-hmm.
But I think your message is correct, and I think he was using that tactically. But I think the ultimate thing is what you said, and what we all know and what we all recognize. There was no post-racial, that was not a post-racial society. And if nothing tells it more clearly, it's said so clearly today in these protests.
Absolutely so.
Yeah.
And you will never get to post-racial America until we close the wealth Grand Canyon that exists between Blacks and whites.
Yeah. Well, which takes us almost, because I want to ask you something else before I get into that question, which I think is essential. What do you see on the protest piece? You said this is not just a moment, this is a movement. And that's a question I frequently ask when I speak to groups. Is this a moment or is this a movement? And I see a movement being translated in terms of protests can continue, but it's not sustained until it's sustained in policy.
Absolutely so.
If it doesn't translate into policy, in fact, they're inextricably tied together. Policy, meaningful policy change from status quo is very difficult to make unless there's protests.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, protests cannot reach an intended objective unless it translates into policy.
Absolutely so.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And it's interesting that I'm a student of Stokely Carmichael. And Kwame, and it is your brother
Sterling
who turned me on to Stokely Carmichael. I was flirting with ideas of Black power, and I was not using the language and terminology until your brilliant brother, who was my mentor, Sterling, said to me, he said, Kevin, what you're really talking about is Black power. He said, you're talking about Black power. And so I went back, and after he told me that, and I read everything I could find on Stokely.
Yeah.
And you usually try to draw a contrast between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I think that's the wrong contrast, because the contrast is between between Stokely and Martin. We try to say Malcolm or Martin. No, it's Stokely and Martin, and they both influenced each other.
Yeah.
But in the summer of '66 in Mississippi, when they had the marches in Mississippi, the marches against fear, after who was it? Meredith was shot in the back, and they picked up his march against fear. And you had two different positions. One was Freedom Now, and then here comes Stokely, who's introducing for the first time Black Power. Well, Stokely said that he really did not want to participate in the march, and this is something I find interesting, with Martin King, because Martin King only would come to town for purposes of agitation. He'd get things stirred up, and then he'd leave. He said SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had already been in Mississippi for months organizing. And he said that Martin Luther King was a part of the agitation, but he said we were trying to organize institutions for the purpose of sustaining what they were agitating about. And until we can develop the organizations that can help mobilize us politically, agitation is important, but
sustain it.
You got to sustain it. You've got to sustain it.
I think you hit it right on the head. I was teaching out the U of L, in fact, at Simmons, and I would tell the students when we would talk about great individuals like Martin Luther King and the usuals, I said he was not a person.
Yeah.
He was a piece of a very complicated effort that is ongoing, that built that framework up under him and still will go beyond him. And but I think that's part. I think a lot of people, they look for, quote unquote, a leader.
Right.
The leader plays a role, very significant role, no question.
He plays a role, right?
But guess what? There's a place for everybody in that piece.
I'm so glad you said that, because King, it's four essentials. I think: agitation, demonstration, negotiations, legislation. And we have to understand that they all work together.
Yeah.
And just because you're not out with the agitation does not mean that you're not in the movement.
Right. Everybody's got a role.
Everybody has a role to play. My role has not been to be on the streets. My role has been to write, to build institutions, to help build a Black institution named Simmons that's educating, helping. I tell the kids at Simmons, when you come here, please know that you're not just getting smart for yourself.
Yeah.
You're getting smart for Black people. In fact, I think I'm going to put that sign up all over the campus. Get smart, not for yourself, but get smart for Black people. So that the role of building institutional strength is part of the movement. Right. And those who build institutional strength cannot minimize the role that those who are on the streets agitating are the role they're playing. And conversely, those who are on the streets engaged in agitation cannot minimize the role that the institutions are playing. And none of us can minimize the role that you have to play as legislation. So it's agitation, it's demonstrations, it's negotiation, it's legislation. And all of us have a role to play.
Well, I'll tell you what, we can agree on one thing for sure, and that is that we both support the protests that are taking place. And I think I join you. I got the sense and the feeling that this is more than a moment. That this is a movement. The question is, where is it going to go? Which raises a very critical question, a very central question to this exchange here today, and that is reparations.
Yeah.
I want to go at this from a couple of angles, but first of all, I want to get from your perspective. I know you've been deep into this subject matter. You've engaged it nationally and locally. You've dealt with it from in a practical sense, in terms of institution building and wealth building, that sort of thing, but also in terms of where do we take this? How do we make this a reality in the United States of America? So I want to get your definition. What do you see? How do you define this thing called reparations? Make it real to our viewing audience.
Reparations is simply repairing, when that's in the word, of course, repairing a people who have been the victims of a grievous injustice. A grievous injustice that was committed by the government. That is what reparations is to me. It is repairing a people who have been damaged by a horrific and grievous injustice committed by the state.
So tell folks why the state, why the government, why is the government on this?
The government is the guilty party because the government created the laws that made Black suffering possible. So it was the government of the United States that made slavery legal from 1776 to 1865. It was the government. This was public policy, which affected my personal policy. I couldn't go to school. Which affected my private policy. I was self-loathing. So the government created the public policy. In 1790, there was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that only whites could be naturalized citizens of the United States. That's 1790. And then in 1850, it was the government that created the fugitive slave laws, which was perhaps the worst law ever committed against Black people in the history of this country, because even freed Blacks in the North were being kidnapped and brought into slavery. That was government actions. It was the government and one of the branches of the government, namely the Supreme Court, that said in the Dred Scott decision, and Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said when Dred Scott was trying to sue for his freedom there in that courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri, that the Black man has no rights that whites are bound to respect. And that was not reversed, by the way, with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. That was reversed with the 13th Amendment of 1865. So we had no rights. That was the government that said that. It was the government that instituted Plessy versus Ferguson. It was the government that refused to provide equal protection under the law of the 14th Amendment with terrorism and lynching. It was the government that did not even institute Plessy versus Ferguson. What most people don't understand about the Brown decision and Charles Alexander Houston, who was the mentor of Thurgood Marshall, who was the head of the chairman of the department of the law school at Howard, that their goal, and he died in 1950, but Charles Alexander Houston's goal was to get them to live out Plessy versus Ferguson. I find that fascinating because he was saying they were suing them on the basis that they had not practiced separate but equal. If you're going to make me separate, then the same allocations that you have for white communities and white schools, you have to equalize that. And it was unequal, which is part of our justice claim, because they violated Plessy versus Ferguson. Because as Dr. Darity rightly says in his book, From Here to Equality, then in the state of Alabama, allocations for a Black student was 32 cents. Allocations for a white student was $15. So if it's going to be equal, that means that if the white student allocation is $15, then you got to take it up and give Black student allocation $15. And white folks said, before we invest that kind of money in Black people, and which Thurgood Marshall and Houston realized, we're going to integrate the schools because it's going to cost too much to bring it up. Well, that's not until 54, and they never did it. So this is about public policies and what the federal government did by not providing Black people equal protection under the law. And this happened legally until 1968. Now, if the Japanese can get reparations in 1986 or 87 under Reagan for something that happened between 1941 and 1945, and our oppression and disenfranchisement is from 1776 until 1968, then if you're going to give it to Native Americans and if you're going to give it to the Japanese, how much more so should be given to Black people who not only did not receive equal protection of the law, but whose labor and was exploited?
Well, you know, there are some that would say, well, I didn't own any slaves. I didn't do anything wrong to these people. Why should this money be taken out of my tax money? That's if you're talking about the government. I think arguably they could say their tax money's involved.
Yeah.
But they conveniently overlook this thing called systemic racism. In other words, the structure that was put in place, legally put into place, actually is held into place by the policies we have of today.
Other policies. And when you're a citizen, you have to take on both the privileges and benefits of citizenship. And you have to take on the burdens and responsibilities of citizenship.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of my tax dollars. I had nothing to do with Geronimo, Cochise, and Sitting Bull. Okay, that was the 19th century.
Right.
But today, my tax dollars are taken out to pay for reservations and reparations to the Native American population because of government policies.
And those policies are questionable too.
Right, which I was not allowed. They took taxes out of me. I didn't intern the Japanese.
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't alive in the 40s. But I had to pay taxes when Ronald Reagan said we're going to repair these Japanese, and I had to pay taxes because as a citizen of the country, I have to take on both I get the benefits, but I have to take on the responsibilities of citizenship. And everyone knows that, even though I don't live on a particular street, my taxes have to pay for that street.
Exactly.
And so that is why it's critical that people understand that reparations is a justice claim that reparationists are making with the federal government.
Right.
Not individuals.
That is about as clear as I've heard it articulated. That's and I think it's hard to refute as well. But it raises a question then. Let's assume that argument is one that is uniformly accepted. Then who are the beneficiaries?
That's a good question. I love what Dr. King said in his book, Stride Towards Freedom. He said, those who have been the victims of special mistreatment should now be the beneficiaries of special treatment. I also like what Lyndon Baines Johnson said at his speech at Howard University, June of 1965, which was a policy speech. Bill Moyers helped to write it. And Johnson said, there is white poverty. We recognize that, but that's class-based. And then he went on to say, but there's Black poverty, or he called it Negro poverty. He said, there are many similarities, but there's some fundamental differences between Negro poverty and white poverty. He said, Negro poverty is the result, the consequence of ancient brutalities, past prejudices, and present day injustices. That's what he said. Ancient brutalities, past prejudices, and present day injustices. So the recipients of reparations are those people who can trace their lineage back to slavery, who built the country, because the debt is owed to them. We were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. Tecumseh Sherman and Stanton, who was Secretary of War under Lincoln. We call it Secretary of State now, but they call it Secretary of War. And Stanton, who was Secretary of War, met with a group of about 26 ministers in Savannah, Georgia, as they were passing through Georgia, you know, his march to the sea when they were burning down Atlanta and all these. Well, he met with a group of ministers led by a minister named Garrison Frazier. And they asked Garrison Frazier and this group of ministers, this kind of radical ministers we need today, by the way. And they said, well, what, Tecumseh Sherman and asked him, well, what do you want? And he said, we want the following. We want 40 acres. We want a mule. We want $100. And then he said, we want white folk to leave us alone. Just leave us alone, because
don't need no help beyond that.
Don't come near us because you're too prejudiced.
Yeah.
That white supremacy germ is going to kick in and going to want to control us. So leave us alone. And they agreed to that with Sherman's Field Order 15, in which we were supposed to get the seacoast, South Carolina, parts of Florida, Georgia. We were supposed to get all this land. And it has been estimated that had we gotten that just based on the labor and the land that just out of slavery, that it would amount today in terms of accrued interest of about $19 trillion. So the recipients of that, we didn't get that money. And simultaneously, while we were being excluded from that, whites were being given free land in the West and the Midwest up to 160 acres per person that they benefit from, that today that has been passed down transgenerationally. So the recipients of reparations should be the descendants of those who did not get that wealth passed down. And the present day wealth gap is all attributable, because wealth is something that is accrued transgenerationally. It's something that you pass down to your children and your children's children and your children's children's children. Well, if your parents were blocked from accessing opportunities to secure wealth, they can pass down to you nothing but poverty. Now, if the government blocked them from securing wealth, then the government has to pay. And that,
if I may, and that resonates on two levels for me, at least two levels. One is exactly what you just said. You promised me 40 acres and a mule, and you didn't deliver. That's one piece. But there's that other piece where the government started giving other parts of wealth and prevented Black folks from even getting that.
Correct.
So you really got two layers here.
You got two layers. When people ask me, what is reparations about? I say three words. Identification. Who are we? Now, I'm a part of a movement called the American Descendants of Slavery, ADOS. And that phrase, descendants of slavery, was coined by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's a lineage-based movement started by Yvette Carnell and the very brilliant Antonio Moore.
Yeah,
both are brilliant. But what they're saying, and I totally agree with, and Dr. Darity does too, is that
just so folks understand before you get into it, Dr. Darity, so the listening audience will know. I know African American Initiative had Dr. Darity and
Yeah.
A. Mullen,
Yes.
Kirsten Mullen on.
Yes.
Characterize him briefly and continue that point, so they know
He-
why you keep raising his voice, his name.
He is the foremost authority from an academic perspective on the issue of reparations on the planet.
Right.
On the planet.
He's done the homework. He's
done
pulled
the
it
work.
together.
He's put it together.
Yeah.
In fact, I always
From an economic standpoint as well.
He's the man, right?
He's an economist.
He's an economist. I always keep his book always near me. That's his
There
book.
it is.
There it is.
University professor.
Yes.
PhD. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
You're making a good point. I'm sorry I interrupted.
So the point I'm making is that Dr. Darity, he affirms the lineage-based movement. And so I say that it's identification. Who are we? And this is how you can know it. Here's my acrostic for justice, because reparations is a justice claim. So here's how you spell out justice. It's easy to remember. Justice, 7 letters. J, Jim Crow. Jim Crow. Government. U, urban renewal, which was Negro removal. S, slavery. T, terrorism, or what we would call lynching. I, incarceration. C, cops, courts. E, exclusion. Who are the people who have, if you can check off yes to all 7, you have to be able to say yes to all 7. If you cannot say yes to all 7, you should not be the recipients of reparations in the United States.
Let me ask you this, because that is a discussion that's going on in many quarters. Some agree to a certain extent,
Sure.
And some don't. How do you reconcile this whole piece with HR 40? And HR 40, by the way, is the piece that was championed by former U.S. Congressman, now deceased, John Conyers, who basically was looking for a mechanism in which to study reparations in order to get this thing from A to Z. Right. How does that fit into this matrix from your perspective?
Good question. Well, I first of all like to affirm what the former generation did to get it started, and it predates John Conyers. Callie House,
yes,
back in the early 20th century was advocating for reparations. So it predates John Conyers. And what triggered John Conyers to push for reparations is that the Japanese got it. So the next year after the Japanese had got reparations, John Conyers said, no, wait a minute. If you're going to give them reparations and we built the country, what about us? So I appreciate what John Conyers did in Cobra and all these other groups early on in terms of pushing the debate or the discussion on reparations. But it has evolved. Just like when you read the initial demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association, when at the Montgomery bus boycott and the MIA said, this is what we want you to do, Montgomery, 1955, in order for us to end the bus boycott of Rosa Parks. You ought to just sometimes just Google search or read Dr. King's initial book, Stride Towards Freedom.
Read it.
And read what the initial demands were. And Gerald, they are so weak
Hmm.
and anemic. They were just talking about being polite,
Yeah.
allowing Black people to stay in the back of the bus and not have to move when white folk come on, or things like allowing some Black bus drivers jobs on Black routes only. It was so weak.
Hmm.
But then as the movements began to progress and it became a global movement with global support, they increased the demands of what they wanted. And that was true democracy. So I think that has happened with the whole reparations movement. So it's being redefined. It's not redefined, but it's being constantly developed.
Yeah.
And I think that what is critical is that I think that the federal government should be at the center of this. I think the federal government, I think that what Dr. Darity is saying, that instead of groups like in Cobra or other groups giving lead to this, that the federal government should put together a commission that is studying this. So I think it should be driven by the federal government.
They should own it.
They should own it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this in this same framework. So what form do you see this as playing out? If we're talking about reparations, I've heard all kinds of things from one end to the other. And the thing that I keep in the back of my mind is, does it lead to wealth? That's in the back of my mind. So if you just hand somebody some dollars, that doesn't necessarily lead to wealth. I mean, people have jobs, they get paid, dollars come and go, unless what? They're invested.
Right.
Land has that 40 acres was a real deal because land was everything. They recognized that back in those days, right? You don't make new land.
No, sir.
But how would that manifest itself now in an urban environment? A country has evolved.
Yeah.
It's more technologically different from what it was in those days. The possibilities, quite frankly, are unlimited out here, depending on creativity and ingenuity. But how would that manifest itself today, do you think, in your mind?
And again, I reference Dr. Darity.
Okay.
And I think it's a great idea. And he says that all Black people are owed at least $800,000. But what he's calling for is what happens in colleges, especially white colleges, not Black colleges. We don't have it. We don't have it. And that is an endowment. So, and an endowment account is set up for Black people. Now, when you have endowments like Harvard has an endowment, maybe about, it's really it's a hedge fund attached to a university.
Right, it's huge.
It's huge. They have an endowment of about $46 billion. Now, all the 101 HBCUs combined have Howard, Morehouse, Spelman, Morgan State, Simmons, Kentucky State, combined, 101 of us have an endowment together of about $2 billion. Now, Harvard doesn't have to worry about anything because they're living off of the interest from that endowment. So what Dr. Darity is saying is that Black people should be given an endowment of so much money, and annually they're getting some payoffs from that endowment. And I think that is, I think for Dr. Darity, and I agree with it, is the crux of what the government should be doing to fix Black America. Now, there's some other things that should be taking place to address the issue of redlining. I think that those families, those communities that have been affected by redlining, there should be specific targeted investment. You don't fix race with class proposals. So for example, when you start saying, well, we're going to have allocations of resources across the board that fix poor communities, that's class. Appalachia, I believe that they should have justice. You know, I believe from, as my book has said, from the hood to the holler.
Economic justice.
Yeah, economic justice. But economic justice is general public policies. Reparations is specific, something tangible, measurable, quantifiable.
And rooted back to that promise that was not kept.
Rooted back to the promise that
everything that flowed from it
goes to a specific people.
Yeah.
So those,
That's a good point. Excellent.
Redlining, I was redlined because of my skin, because America is a skintocracy. Never has been a democracy. It's a skintocracy. So I was redlined because of my skin color. The government did that. The government needs to fix redlined communities, and we need to quit talking it. You know, I'm so sick and tired of all these initiatives that city government has and state government has and federal government. No, quit talking and write the check. Write the
Action.
check, man. You know what I mean? Write the check, okay? And take, for example, infrastructure. Now, like what happened in terms of Flint, and I heard that they're going to get some recompense for that. But in terms of the water crisis in Flint, and that's not simply unique to Flint. That's West Louisville. That's our community.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Environmental racism.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that toxic waste dumps are disproportionately placed in communities that are Black and poor. That was by design. So my mother, who died at the age of 36 from a rare cancer, had we known what we knew now, we know now why she died. We know what was the cause of it. But my mother died a week from my 11th birthday at the age of 36. She lived at 4631 Westchester Avenue, which is around the corner from where you and I live in deep West Louisville. I remember, I don't know if you remember, but as a kid, when you would come outdoors on your cars in this,
like snowflakes.
it was like snowflakes that was covering your car. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. I remember.
Okay, so I try to tell my kids that, you know, you won't believe it, but we had snow in July.
Yeah.
Because soot was all over our cars and things, and that caused cancer.
Yeah. Ash.
Yeah. All right. That's in every community in America. That's a crime against humanity.
Yeah.
The United Nations would call what America has done a crime against humanity. And crimes against humanity must be atoned.
Well, I'm going to tell you something interesting, because I want to save a little time for another subject matter. But something interesting has happened. It's not exactly what we've been talking about. But what's happening in Asheville, North Carolina, is not just the mere fact that they took up the word, took up the perspective.
Yes, sir.
That gave acknowledgement to and validation to reparations.
Yes, sir.
Providence, Rhode Island.
Isn't that something?
Some people play that off, and if you're talking in the sense we're talking right here, you have to say, well, that ain't really getting where we're talking about, you know, in real sense. But in the whole broader context of the discussion, I found that extraordinary.
Can I tell you who we should be applauding for that? And even Dr. Darity acknowledges that. And that is that Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore have been driving this thing through the back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Yeah. Through their podcast on YouTube that has expanded over the last 4 years.
Say that again. Give those names again.
Yvette Carnell, Breaking Brown
Okay.
Antonio Moore, Tone Talks.
Okay.
Now, what some will try to do is to say it was because of the article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote
Yeah.
back in 2014 called Reparations that
Right.
had to do with redlining in Chicago.
That was in the Atlantic.
That was in the Atlantic, and that was a
Atlantic
great article.
magazine. Yeah. Mhm.
But nothing happened as a result of that article in terms of grassroots
Right.
activism.
Yeah.
It was the difference that made the difference was Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell. In fact, even the woman who wrote the 1619 project, Hannah Nicole Jones, well, she's now using the terms and language. She won the Pulitzer for it, of Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell. Even Dr. Darity cites them in his work.
Yeah.
From Here to Equality, cites Antonio Moore.
Yeah.
So it is spreading. And let me say this, and that is, no one thought that William Lloyd Garrison, when the abolitionists in the 1930s, no one thought that they would ever be able to end slavery when he started the abolitionist movement. They were a fringe group.
Yeah.
Okay, but it ended. And no one thought. I remember when I started preaching about reparations, my members would look at me, Gerald, and I had so many naysayers and they, oh, you wouldn't believe some of the looks I got. Oh, here he goes with that reparations again. Well,
Yeah.
I'm the kind of preacher. There was a song they had back in the 70s that said, if loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right.
I remember that.
Well, look, man, if preaching about reparations is wrong, I don't want to be right.
Yeah, I hear you. We're going to end on reparations on that note, but we're going to I got to get to another subject. We got about 3 minutes, less than 3 minutes left. But I want to talk about, we have an election coming up, a national election of tremendous import. In fact, every election is of tremendous import. We have a Senate race, which really plays into that election potentially. We're talking about the current president. I don't have to get into who, what, and all that means. Everybody knows what that is. But maybe not everyone understands how key that Senate race is, wherever it is in the United States, including Kentucky, to a potential changing of the guard in the White House.
Yes.
You also got to change that guard in the Senate, because we have people in the Senate, such as the current head of the Senate, McConnell, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely.
I mean, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
This guy tries to separate himself from Trump conveniently,
Right.
and about, I mean, clearly a racist in his actions, if not his heart, although his actions sort of confirm his heart.
Absolutely.
But here we have a guy that enables him to the extent that he can continue to do this cruel work that he does.
He's the wind beneath his wings.
So what do you say about voting? We got young people in protests. We have poor folks who are disillusioned, and you can't really be critical. They've seen nothing but not a positive result from all that we say we should do and get an outcome from. What do you say to these folks in this election?
If you don't mind me using a Hegelian dialectic.
Go for it.
A thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Let me give the thesis. The thesis is get out and vote. Because voting can change things. That's the thesis. Antithesis, in which a lot of people are saying, including Yvette and Antonio, that we must vote down ballot and be very discerning with our vote, because voting politics is an exchange. It's not something for nothing. It's something for something. You got to give me something for my vote.
I think I can buy into that one.
Yeah. Okay. So
I got your message. We're out of time. I just want to thank you so much. This was enjoyable, but it was educational. and it
And
was straightforward.
you're great. You do such a great job.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. I can't say enough about the work that you're doing and that you're continuing to do. And I just wish you good health and good vision and good strength in continuing that fight, because it's a good fight and it's a righteous fight.
Man, you're wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're my senator.
Thank you.
Okay.
I tell you what, I'm glad you are my spiritual leader. How's that? I'll take that.
Okay.
Well, let me say it this way. Folks, this is Straight Talk. You know that I really appreciate you checking in every Saturday. Please share this. This is something people should hear from. This is about as clear as I've heard this discussion about reparations laid out. It is about as forceful and powerful. We've even got references that you can check out yourself to get into that particular subject matter. But at the end of the day, we must vote. We must vote in a democracy. We live in that democracy. We're not separate from it. We must drive it. We cannot just let it happen. We have to make it happen. And we can make it happen. So with that being said, God bless you. And as I always say when I end, do the right thing.